He thought she had just ruined the most important day of his life, but in less than 10 seconds, he would realize she was the only reason he was still alive. The ballroom shimmered under crystal chandeliers, gold light reflecting off polished marble floors that stretched wider than a basketball court, every inch filled with the city's most powerful names dressed in tailored suits and silk gowns, their laughter soft but calculated, the kind that belonged to people who never had to worry about consequences. At the center of it all stood Adrian Castellano, 6'2", composed, his white tuxedo cut to perfection, every movement precise, controlled, the kind of man who didn't just walk into a room, but owned it without saying a word. Beside him, his bride smiled for the cameras, her hand resting lightly on his arm, diamonds catching the light with every subtle shift, a picture of elegance that had taken months to build, a union that promised power, stability, and something far more dangerous beneath the surface. No one noticed the woman standing near the back of the room, dressed in a simple black uniform, her presence designed to disappear into the background, her hands steady despite the tremor running through her chest, her eyes fixed not on the couple, but on a single glass resting on a silver tray, untouched, waiting. Naomi Carter had spent the last 3 months learning how to be invisible, moving through rooms like a shadow, cleaning, serving, existing just enough to be useful, but never enough to be remembered, because invisibility meant safety, and safety was the only thing she could afford. But tonight, invisibility felt like a lie she could no longer hide behind. The music swelled as the master of ceremonies raised his voice, announcing the final toast, the moment everyone had been waiting for, the symbolic beginning of a new empire built on trust and loyalty, words that echoed across the room with a weight Naomi could feel pressing against her ribs. She saw the tray move closer to Adrian, saw the glass lifted with careful precision, saw the faint ripple in the liquid that no one else seemed to notice, a detail so small it would have gone completely unseen by anyone who wasn't already looking for it. Her breath caught. This was it. Every instinct screamed at her to step back, to let it happen, to protect herself the way she always had, because people like her didn't interfere in the lives of men like him, not without consequences that rarely ended well. But something inside her refused to stay silent, something stronger than fear, stronger than the rules she had learned to survive by. Before anyone could react, before her mind could catch up with her body, Naomi moved. The distance between them disappeared in seconds, her footsteps silent against the marble, her heart pounding so loud she was certain it would give her away. Adrian turned just slightly, sensing the shift in the room, his eyes narrowing as the unexpected movement broke the perfect symmetry of the moment. And then she did the unthinkable. She reached up and kissed him. Gasps cut through the air like a sudden drop in temperature, conversations dying mid-sentence, cameras freezing in place, every eye snapping toward the scene that had just shattered the illusion of perfection. For a split second, the world seemed to stop. Adrian didn't move. His body went still, his mind trying to process what had just happened, the audacity, the timing, the impossibility of it. Then the room erupted. Voices rose, sharp and confused, security stepping forward, the bride's expression cracking into something unrecognizable as shock turned to fury. Naomi stepped back, her hands trembling now, her chest rising and falling as she met Adrian's gaze for the first time since she had crossed that invisible line. There was no apology in her eyes. Only urgency. Only fear. Only truth he wasn't ready to understand. And in that moment, before a single word was spoken, something deep inside Adrian Castellano told him that this wasn't madness, it was a warning. The silence shattered all at once, not with noise but with judgment, the kind that spreads faster than sound, eyes narrowing, whispers forming before anyone dared to speak them out loud, because what they had just witnessed did not belong in a room like this, not in a moment crafted with such precision, not from someone like her. Adrian Castellano's gaze locked onto Naomi, and for a second longer than anyone expected, he did not react, which in itself was more unsettling than anger, because men like him did not hesitate unless something beneath the surface demanded their attention. Then his jaw tightened, the control returning like a switch had been flipped, and the weight of the room shifted back into place as if gravity itself answered to him. "Explain," he said, his voice low, steady, but carrying across the ballroom with absolute authority, cutting through the chaos without effort. Security had already moved in, two men stepping forward with calculated precision, their hands ready but restrained, waiting for a signal that had not yet come. Naomi could feel them closing in, the pressure of their presence tightening around her, but she did not look away from Adrian. Not now. Not after everything she had risked to stand here. The bride's voice broke through next, sharp and trembling with outrage, demanding answers, demanding removal, demanding control over a situation that had slipped beyond her reach, but Adrian did not look at her. Not yet. And that was the first crack no one else seemed to notice. Naomi swallowed, her throat dry, her pulse racing, every instinct screaming at her to back down, to apologize, to say anything that would make this easier, safer, survivable. Instead, she leaned in just enough for only him to hear, her voice barely above a whisper, steady despite the storm inside her. "Do not drink it." The words were simple, almost fragile, but they landed with a weight that shifted something behind his eyes, subtle, dangerous, the kind of shift that only someone like Adrian Castellano could mask from everyone else in the room. For a fraction of a second, his gaze flicked past her shoulder, toward the tray, toward the glass that had been meant for him, untouched, waiting. Then he looked back at her, searching, measuring, not for fear, but for truth. "Take her aside," he said finally, his tone unchanged, but the meaning behind it different now, layered, deliberate. The guards stepped closer, their grip firm but not aggressive, guiding Naomi away from the center of the room as the murmurs swelled again. Confusion replacing outrage, curiosity replacing certainty. She did not resist, but her eyes never left Adrian, not even as the distance between them grew, because she needed him to understand, needed him to see what she had seen before it was too late. Across the room, the bride recovered quickly, her smile returning for the guests, her posture flawless, but there was something tighter in her movements now, something less certain, a fraction too controlled, like someone adjusting to a script that had just been interrupted. Adrian turned slightly, just enough to pick up the glass from the tray, holding it between his fingers with a calm that seemed effortless. But his mind was no longer on the ceremony, no longer on the performance, no longer on the future everyone had assumed was already decided. The liquid inside the glass caught the light, perfectly still, perfectly clear, and yet now it looked different, not because it had changed, but because he had. Around him, the celebration tried to continue, music rising again, conversations restarting, but the rhythm was off, the illusion fractured in a way that could not be repaired. Adrian lifted the glass slowly, bringing it closer, his eyes narrowing just slightly as he studied it, not like a groom celebrating his wedding, but like a man who had just been handed a question with only one answer that mattered. And somewhere across the room, held between two men who did not yet understand why she mattered, Naomi Carter stood completely still, her hands no longer trembling, because she had already made her choice, and now everything depended on whether he would make his. Adrian Castellano did not drink, and that single decision, so small on the surface, rippled through the room in a way no one could yet understand, because the man they all knew would have raised that glass without hesitation, would have honored tradition, would have completed the moment exactly as expected, but instead he paused, the rim of the glass hovering just an inch from his lips, his eyes no longer reflecting celebration but calculation. The music faltered again, subtle but noticeable, as if even the orchestra could feel the shift in atmosphere. And across the ballroom, conversations thinned into quiet observation, guests pretending to continue their evening while watching him from the corners of their vision. He lowered the glass slowly, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to break the rhythm of the ceremony. And in that quiet motion, control returned entirely to him. "Bring me another," he said calmly to the nearest server, his tone effortless, almost casual, but those who knew him understood that nothing he did was without purpose. The server hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded and stepped forward, replacing the glass with another from the same tray, identical in every visible way, identical in every expectation. Adrian did not touch it. Instead, his gaze drifted, not to the bride, not to the guests, but to the edges of the room, to the staff, to the movement most people ignored, because power was not just about what was seen, It was about what was missed. Across the ballroom, Naomi stood held between two men who no longer treated her as a threat, but as a question. Their grip loosened just enough to show uncertainty, because something had changed in the way Adrian had reacted, and they felt it even if they could not explain it. Her heart still raced, but her breathing had steadied, her eyes fixed on him, waiting, hoping he would follow the thread she had risked everything to place in his hands. The bride stepped closer to Adrian now. Her smile returned, her voice soft enough to sound reassuring. But there was a tension beneath it that did not belong in a moment like this, a tightness in her posture that had not been there before. "It is just a misunderstanding," she said gently, her hand brushing his arm as if to guide him back into place, back into the script everyone expected him to follow. Adrian looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time that evening, something in his expression did not align with the image she had prepared for. It was not anger. It was not affection. It was distance. A quiet, deliberate distance that placed her just outside the center of his attention. "Of course," he replied smoothly, but his eyes had already moved past her, tracking something else entirely. A man near the bar, someone who did not belong to the inner circle, someone who had been still for too long, watching instead of celebrating. Adrian's fingers tightened slightly around the stem of the glass he had not yet touched, and then he made a decision that shifted everything again. He turned to one of his men standing discreetly nearby and spoke just loud enough to be heard by no one else. "Have this tested." The words were simple, almost routine, but the effect was immediate, a silent current running through the room, invisible but undeniable. The glass was taken without question, without hesitation, because orders from Adrian Castellano were never suggestions. The bride's smile flickered, just for a second, so brief most would have missed it, but Adrian did not miss anything now. Across the room, Naomi felt it too, that subtle fracture widening, that invisible line being crossed, and for the first time since she stepped forward, hope replaced fear, not fully, not safely, but enough to keep her standing. The room did not go silent this time, but it grew still in a different way, like a held breath waiting to be released, and Adrian Castellano, standing at the center of it all, no longer looked like a groom celebrating his future, but like a man who had just realized his present was built on something far more fragile than anyone had dared to admit. Time stretched in a way that made every second feel deliberate, measured not by the ticking of a clock, but by the quiet tension settling over the room, the kind that made people lower their voices without knowing why, the kind that turned celebration into observation. Adrian Castellano did not move from his place at the center of the ballroom, but everything around him adjusted, as if the gravity of his focus had shifted direction, pulling attention away from the ceremony and towards something unseen. The glass was gone now, taken for testing without explanation, and in its absence, a silence lingered that no amount of music could fully cover. The bride stood beside him, her posture flawless, her smile carefully maintained, but there was a flicker in her eyes now, a brief hesitation that broke the illusion she had held so perfectly just moments before. "This is unnecessary," she said softly, her voice controlled, her hand resting lightly against his arm again, as if proximity alone could restore what had been disrupted. Adrian did not look down at her hand. He did not acknowledge the gesture. Instead, his gaze remained fixed on the movement of the room, on the patterns that no longer aligned, on the small inconsistencies that only revealed themselves once doubt had been introduced. Across the ballroom, a server adjusted a tray that no longer needed adjusting. A guest checked his watch too quickly. A man near the bar shifted his stance, as if preparing to leave, but did not. These were details most would never notice. But Adrian had built his life on noticing what others ignored, and now every instinct he had trusted for years was quietly aligning in a direction he could not dismiss. Naomi Carter stood where she had been placed, no longer struggling against the hands that held her, because the urgency that had driven her forward had been passed on, and now all she could do was wait, her eyes steady despite the weight pressing against her chest, her mind replaying the moment she had seen it, the subtle exchange, the glass set aside just a fraction too deliberately, the glance between people who thought no one was watching. She had not been meant to see it. That was the part that stayed with her, the reason she had moved when every rule told her to stay invisible. Adrian turned slightly, just enough to face her again across the distance. And for a brief moment, the noise of the room seemed to fall away entirely, leaving only the space between them, charged with something unspoken but understood. He stepped down from the platform, each movement calm, controlled, unhurried, but purposeful in a way that drew every eye without demanding it. Conversation stopped again, not because anyone was told to stop, but because no one wanted to miss what would happen next. The bride followed a step behind, her composure still intact, but her pace just slightly off, just enough to suggest that she was no longer leading the moment, but reacting to it. Adrian stopped a few feet from Naomi, close enough now to see the details others overlooked, the steadiness in her gaze, the absence of panic, the quiet certainty that did not match the role she was supposed to play. "Look at me," he said, his voice low, not a command meant to control, but a request meant to understand. She met his eyes without hesitation. Around them, the room held its breath again, not with shock this time, but with anticipation, because something had shifted beyond spectacle into something far more serious, something that no longer belonged to gossip or curiosity. It belonged to truth. Adrian studied her for a moment that felt longer than it was, measuring not her words, but her silence, because silence, in his world, often revealed more than anything spoken. Then, without raising his voice, without breaking the calm he had reclaimed, he asked the question that changed everything. "What did you see?" And in that moment, Naomi Carter realized that the most dangerous part of what she had done was not stepping forward, not breaking the rules, not even risking her position. It was telling the truth to a man who would not ignore it. Naomi did not answer right away, and that hesitation, so brief it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else, only made Adrian Castellano watch her more closely, because in his world, people either spoke too quickly to hide something or stayed silent because the truth carried weight. She drew a slow breath, steadying herself, not out of fear this time, but out of precision, because what she said next would either confirm everything or collapse it completely. "The glass was switched," she said quietly, her voice clear enough to carry only to him, but firm enough that it did not waver, not by the server who brought it to you, but before that, when the tray was still near the service entrance. Adrian's expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened, like a lens adjusting focus. "Who?" he asked, a single word, controlled, direct. Naomi shook her head slightly. "I did not see his face clearly, but he was not part of the regular staff. He wore the same uniform, but his shoes did not match. Everyone else had standard issue, black, polished. His were different, slightly worn on the sides, like he had been standing outside for a long time. It was a small detail, almost insignificant, but Adrian understood immediately why it mattered, because details like that were not mistakes, they were cracks in a disguise. Around them, the room remained suspended in that fragile stillness, guests pretending to engage in quiet conversations while their attention drifted back again and again to the center where something unspoken was unfolding. The bride stepped closer, her patience thinning now beneath the surface of her composed exterior. "Adrian, this is absurd," she said softly, but there was a sharp edge beneath the softness. "We are letting a servant create a scene based on nothing." Adrian did not look at her right away. His gaze stayed on Naomi, as if weighing not just her words, but the intention behind them, the risk she had taken, the fact that she had nothing to gain and everything to lose. That alone carried a kind of truth no performance could replicate. "What else?" he asked Naomi, his voice still low, still measured. Naomi swallowed again, her eyes flicking briefly toward the far side of the room, toward the bar where she had first noticed the man lingering too long, watching too closely. "There was someone near the bar," she continued. "He kept checking the tray, not like a guest waiting for a drink, but like he was waiting for something specific to happen." Adrian followed her gaze without turning his head, his peripheral vision already mapping the room, already identifying the man she described without needing to make it obvious. The pieces were aligning now, not fully, but enough to shift the situation from uncertainty to strategy. Just then, one of Adrian's men approached quietly, leaning in just enough to speak without drawing attention. "Sir," he said under his breath, "the preliminary test, something is off." It was not a full confirmation, not yet, but it was enough. Adrian exhaled slowly, not in relief, but an acknowledgement, as if a question had just been answered in the only way that mattered. The bride's hand tightened, slightly at his arm, a reaction so subtle it could have been mistaken for nervousness, but Adrian felt it, registered it, added it to the growing list of details that no longer fit the narrative he had been given. He finally turned to look at her, and this time, the distance in his expression was unmistakable. It was not coldness. It was clarity. "We are going to pause the ceremony," he said calmly, his voice carrying just enough to ripple through the room without causing panic. "There is something that needs to be addressed." A murmur spread instantly, confusion rising, but no one dared challenge him, because authority, real authority, did not need to be explained. Across from him, Naomi stood still, her shoulders lowering just slightly, not in relief, but in the quiet understanding that the truth had crossed the line from possibility into reality. And in that moment, Adrian Castellano knew that whatever had been planned for him tonight had not failed by chance. It had failed because someone no one had been watching chose to step forward and be seen. The music did not stop, but it no longer sounded like celebration. It sounded like something trying to continue out of habit, out of denial, while the truth quietly took its place at the center of the room. Adrian Castellano stepped forward, away from the stage that had been prepared for him, and in doing so, he removed himself from the role everyone had assigned to him. No longer the groom, no longer the symbol of union, but something far more dangerous, a man who had begun to question everything around him. The guests shifted, some stepping back instinctively, others pretending to remain where they were, but no one could ignore the change in atmosphere, the subtle but undeniable shift from elegance to scrutiny. Across the ballroom, the man Naomi had pointed out near the bar was no longer still, his posture adjusted just slightly, his attention no longer casual, and that alone was enough for Adrian to confirm what his instincts had already accepted. He did not point, did not call attention, did not create a scene. Instead, he moved with intention, each step measured, each glance deliberate, his presence alone. Enough to redirect the invisible currents of the room. "Lock the exits," he said quietly to one of his men as he passed, the words spoken without urgency, but carrying absolute finality. The command spread without announcement, subtle movements at the doors, staff repositioning, security blending into place in a way that most guests would interpret as routine, but those paying attention would feel as something else entirely. Naomi watched it happen, her breath catching not in fear, but in realization, because this was no longer about a single glass or a single moment. It was about something planned, something layered, something that had expected him to follow a path he had now stepped away from. The bride followed again, closer this time, her composure beginning to fracture in ways only someone like Adrian would recognize, her smile fading just enough to reveal tension beneath. "You are overreacting," she said, her voice still controlled, but no longer soft. "This is unnecessary, and it is embarrassing." Adrian stopped walking then, not abruptly, but with a stillness that carried more weight than any sudden movement. He turned to her slowly, his eyes meeting hers with a clarity that stripped away everything she had been presenting until now. "Is it?" he replied, not as a question, but as a statement waiting for her to fill the space it created. She held his gaze, but for the first time, there was something behind it that did not belong there, something calculating, something that did not match the role she had been playing all evening. Adrian did not need her answer. He had already begun to see the pattern. Behind them, one of his men approached again, closer this time, his voice low but urgent enough to matter. "It is confirmed," he said. That was all. No explanation, no elaboration, just confirmation, and it was enough to shift everything from suspicion into certainty. The room did not know yet, but Adrian did, and that knowledge changed the way he stood, the way he breathed, the way he looked at the people around him. He turned slightly, his gaze sweeping across the ballroom once more, not searching now, but identifying, connecting, placing each detail into a structure that had been hidden until this moment. The man near the bar attempted to move, just a step, just enough to suggest departure without drawing attention, but it was too late for that. Adrian's voice followed him, calm, controlled, impossible to ignore. "Stay where you are." The words did not rise, did not echo, but they reached every corner of the room, and with them came a silence so complete it felt intentional. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the music seemed to fade into the background, reduced to something distant and irrelevant. Naomi stood exactly where she had been, her hands now free, no longer held, no longer restrained, because the room itself had shifted in her favor in a way she could never have imagined. Adrian Castellano did not look back at her this time, but he did not need to. The trust had already been placed, not with words, but with action, and in that moment, the line between power and dignity had quietly begun to blur. The man near the bar froze, not because he had been touched or stopped, but because he understood exactly who had spoken, and more importantly, what it meant when Adrian Castellano chose to speak in that tone, calm, measured, leaving no room for interpretation or escape. The distance between them felt longer now, not in space, but in consequence, every step that had not yet been taken suddenly carrying weight. Around them, the guests no longer pretended to ignore what was happening, their attention fully drawn in, the quiet tension turning into something sharper, something undeniable. Adrian did not raise his voice again. He did not need to. He simply stood there, watching, his presence anchoring the entire room in place. The man hesitated, then slowly turned, his expression controlled but no longer relaxed, his eyes scanning for an exit that no longer existed. "You came in through the service in trance," Adrian said, not as a guess, but as a conclusion already reached, his voice carrying just enough to cut through the silence. The man did not respond, but the slight tightening of his jaw was answer enough. Across the room, Naomi felt her pulse steady in a way she had not expected, because what had once been uncertainty was now unfolding exactly as she had feared, but also exactly as she had hoped it would be stopped. Adrian took a step closer, unhurried, his gaze unwavering. "You were waiting for a moment," he continued. "Not for attention, not for celebration, but for timing." The words landed with precision, each one narrowing the space between assumption and truth. The man exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just slightly, as if acknowledging that the performance was no longer necessary. Still, he said nothing. That silence spoke louder than denial ever could. Behind Adrian, the bride stood perfectly still, her hands clasped lightly in front of her, her expression composed. But her eyes had changed, no longer pleading, no longer dismissive, but watchful, calculating in a way that did not belong to innocence. Adrian did not turn to her yet, but he felt it, that shift, that alignment between suspicion and realization growing clearer with every second. One of his men moved closer to the man by the bar, not aggressively, but with quiet authority, positioning himself just enough to remove any illusion of freedom. The room held its breath again, but this time it was different, no longer waiting for spectacle, but for confirmation, for the moment when everything hidden would surface. Adrian stopped just a few feet away from the man, close enough now to see the details Naomi had described, the slight wear on the shoes, the tension in his posture, the absence of surprise. "Who sent you?" Adrian asked, his voice lower now, almost conversational, but carrying a weight that pressed against the silence. The man finally looked directly at him, and for a moment, there was something like hesitation, not fear, but calculation, as if deciding whether speaking would change anything at all. Then, slowly, he shifted his gaze past Adrian, not to the exits, not to the guards, but to the stage, to the place where the bride stood. It was a small movement, subtle, almost dismissible, but in a room where every detail had begun to matter, it was enough. Adrian followed that glance without turning his head, and in that instant, the final piece settled into place. The connection was no longer theoretical. It was visible. It was real. The air in the ballroom changed again, not with noise, but with understanding, a quiet realization spreading through those close enough to see what had just been revealed without a single word being spoken. Adrian closed his eyes for the briefest second, not in doubt, but in acceptance, and when he opened them again, the man standing there was no longer the groom who had been preparing to toast his future, but someone who had just seen the truth beneath it. And somewhere behind him, Naomi Carter stood still, her eyes steady, because she understood before anyone else did that the most dangerous betrayal in the room had never been standing near the bar. The silence did not break, it deepened, settling over the ballroom like a weight no one could shake off, Because now the truth was no longer hidden behind suspicion. It was standing in plain sight, waiting to be acknowledged. Adrian Castellano did not rush, did not react with anger or disbelief, because men like him did not need volume to assert control. They needed clarity, and in that moment, everything had become painfully clear. Slowly, he turned, not toward the man near the bar, but toward the stage, toward the woman who had stood beside him only minutes ago as his future. Every step he took was measured, deliberate, his polished shoes echoing softly against the marble floor in a rhythm that drew every eye with him. The bride did not move at first, her posture still perfect, her expression composed, but her stillness now felt different, no longer graceful, but calculated, as if she was deciding which version of herself to reveal next. "You should explain," Adrian said, his voice calm, almost quiet, but carrying across the entire room with a precision that left no space for avoidance. The words were not loud, but they landed heavier than any accusation. A faint murmur moved through the guests, confusion turning into realization, realization into unease, because what had once been a celebration was now something else entirely, something no one had prepared for. The bride smiled then, but it was not the same smile she had worn before. It lacked warmth, lacked softness, replaced instead by something sharper, something that did not need approval. "You are listening to a maid," she said evenly, her tone controlled, but stripped of the gentle elegance she had displayed earlier. Someone who overstepped her place for attention. Her words were directed at Adrian, but her eyes flicked briefly toward Naomi, and in that glance, there was no dismissal, only recognition, as if she had already accounted for her and simply had not expected her to act. Adrian did not respond immediately. He watched her the same way he had watched everything else tonight, not for what she said, but for what she revealed without meaning to. "He looked at you," Adrian said finally, his voice still level, referring not to himself, but to the man by the bar, not at the exits, not at the guards. "At you." The room shifted again, that single observation cutting deeper than accusation, because it was not emotional, it was factual. The bride held his gaze, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them like a line neither could step back from. Then, slowly, she exhaled, and something in her posture changed, not collapsing, not breaking, but releasing the illusion she no longer needed to maintain. "You were never meant to see it this way," she said quietly, her voice no longer performing, no longer soft for the room, but direct, almost tired, as if the effort of pretending had finally become unnecessary. A ripple of shock moved through the guests, not loud, but undeniable, because the shift in her tone alone was enough to confirm what no one had wanted to believe. Adrian's expression did not change, but his eyes hardened in a way that removed any remaining doubt. "Why?" he asked, not out of confusion, but out of completion, as if the answer would simply close the final gap. She tilted her head slightly, studying him in a way that mirrored his own calm, her composure now fully intact in a different form, one that did not need approval or admiration. "Because power invites betrayal," she replied, her voice steady, "and you trusted too easily." It was not shouted, not dramatic, just stated, and that made it more unsettling than anything else. Around them, the room felt smaller, the air heavier, every guest suddenly aware that they were no longer witnessing something distant, but something real, something that had been hidden beneath elegance and ceremony. Adrian stood there for a moment, absorbing it, not reacting, not questioning further, because the truth had already done its work. Then, without raising his voice, without looking away, he spoke again, and this time, there was no ambiguity left. "It is over." The words were simple, but they did not refer to the ceremony, not to the evening, not even to the relationship standing in front of him. They referred to something deeper, something final. And in the quiet that followed, no one moved, no one spoke, because everyone understood that what had just ended was not a wedding, but a deception that had almost cost a life. No one argued, not with the words, not with the silence that followed them, because when Adrian Castellano said something was over, it did not require confirmation, it became reality. The bride did not protest, did not raise her voice, did not attempt to regain control of the moment, Because she understood just as clearly as everyone else that whatever leverage she had believed she possessed had dissolved the second the truth had surfaced. She simply stood there, her posture still composed, her expression calm, but now stripped of illusion, no longer pretending to belong to a future that no longer existed. Adrian held her gaze for a moment longer, not out of emotion, but out of finality, as if closing a chapter without needing to revisit it. Then he turned away, and that movement alone carried more weight than anything he could have said. Behind him, his men stepped forward, not forcefully, not dramatically, but with quiet authority, guiding both the man from the bar and the woman who had once stood as his bride away from the center of the room, removing them from the narrative they had tried to control. The guests parted without being asked, creating space instinctively, because no one wanted to stand in the path of something that had just revealed its true nature. The ballroom, once filled with laughter and expectation, now felt different, not broken, but reset, as if everything superficial had been cleared away, leaving only what mattered. Adrian walked back toward the center slowly, his presence still commanding, but no longer performing, no longer fitting into the role that had been prepared for him. He stopped near where Naomi stood, the distance between them now intentional, no longer defined by hierarchy, but by acknowledgement. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the noise of the room fading into something distant, something irrelevant compared to the quiet understanding that had formed between them. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly, not out of fear, but out of habit, the instinct to return to invisibility still present even after everything that had happened. "Look at me," Adrian said, his voice calm, not demanding, but steady. She lifted her gaze, meeting his without hesitation this time. He studied her for a moment, not as an employer evaluating an employee, not as a man judging a mistake, but as someone recognizing the weight of a decision that had altered the course of his life. "You knew what would happen if you stepped forward," he said quietly. Naomi nodded once, her voice soft but certain when she answered. "Yes." There was no elaboration, no justification, just truth, and that alone was enough. Adrian exhaled slowly, not in relief, but in understanding, because courage like that did not come from comfort. It came from something deeper, something he had not expected to find in a place he had stopped looking. Around them, the guests remained silent, watching, waiting, unsure how to respond to a moment that no longer followed any script they understood. Adrian straightened slightly, his expression returning to its usual composure, but something in his eyes had changed, something less distant, less guarded. "You are not just staff," he said, the words simple, but carrying a weight that shifted everything Naomi had believed about her place in that room. She did not respond immediately, because for the first time, she did not need to defend herself, did not need to prove anything. The truth had already done that for her. Adrian turned his gaze briefly, toward the ballroom, toward the people who had witnessed everything, and then back to her. "You reminded me of something tonight," he added, his voice quieter now, almost reflective. Naomi held his gaze, waiting, not expecting anything, not asking for anything. Adrian paused for just a second, then spoke the words that would stay long after the night had ended. "What dignity looks like." And in that moment, with the chandeliers still glowing above and the echoes of a celebration that never happened fading into memory, the room did not erupt, did not applaud, did not react at all. It simply remained still, as if understanding that something far more important than a wedding had taken place, something that did not need noise to be remembered. A powerful wedding night turns into a moment of truth when a black maid risks everything to interrupt a carefully staged ceremony and silently protect a mafia boss from a hidden betrayal that no one else could see. Beneath the elegance of chandeliers and polished marble, subtle details begin to unravel a dangerous plan, revealing how trust, power, and perception collide in a world where appearances deceive and silence carries meaning. This cinematic story blends tension, emotion, and moral awakening, capturing the essence of dark romance through a shocking act that shifts the balance between authority and humanity. As the mafia boss moves from suspicion to clarity, the black maid stands as the quiet force of courage, embodying dignity in a space that never expected her to matter, redefining what dark romance truly represents. Every glance, every pause, And every decision builds a layered narrative where loyalty is tested and truth emerges without chaos, delivering a gripping dark romance experience rooted in restraint, intelligence, and emotional depth. The unfolding confrontation exposes betrayal not through spectacle, but through observation, as the Mafia Boss reclaims control with calm authority while recognizing the unexpected strength of the one person everyone overlooked, reinforcing the emotional core of dark romance. In the end, this story is not just about survival or deception, but about the moment power chooses to listen and dignity stands unshaken, leaving behind a lasting impression of what dark romance can achieve when silence speaks louder than force.